This time on the Prop Master, well, we prepped the helmet for paint, which is basically just a nice way of saying the time of eternal sanding. First off, you might have noticed that the helmet looks a little bit different than it did in the last video. I'm not talking about the silver paint or the outlines that are drawn all over half the helmet. Now, you're going to have to wait for the next video to find out about those. I'm talking about the helmet itself. And basically, right after I posted the last video, I was looking at the helmet and also looking at some screen captures of Sabine's helmet, and it was just really obvious that the eye part of my visor was just way too open. So I took a couple of strips of foam and I went ahead and closed those up. And then I amended the online templates so you won't have to worry about that. However, if you downloaded your templates before late September 2017, you're going to want to go ahead and update those. Basically, just make sure that your templates have the word new in the title and you'll be fine. Secondly, it's becoming very obvious that I am not going to finish 3 complete Mandalorian outfits by Halloween. I just completely underestimated the amount of time that filming, editing, and making templates was going to add to the overall process. Let me put it in perspective. Last November, I made 3 complete helmets, all the way through paint. I made a prototype, a more advanced prototype, and then I finished the first part of the Mandalorian series, which was a Jango Fett helmet for my son. Then I started this channel, and in the last 10 months, I've managed to do 1 3/4 of a helmet. Now don't get me wrong, the new helmets are much better than they would have been had I not been doing the channel. It's just that it's costing way more time than I could have imagined. So, unfortunately, I can only guarantee that I'm going to finish this helmet before Halloween. The rest may not be ready until next con season. I just can't believe how much extra time the channel has added to the process. Anyway, let's get back to this video. This time, we're going to smooth everything down, fill up any gaps there might be in the helmet, seal it all up, and add a little strength. And if we're going to get all that done in one video, we better get started. So now that we have all of the parts actually put on the helmet, we can start making this look like Sabine's helmet. And the first thing we need to do is to smooth out any bumps or lips where pieces of foam come together. So the main areas you really need to watch out for are going to be these seams up at on the dome part of the helmet. And less important are going to be these seams, especially the top seam here on the cheekbone. You probably want to make this one pretty smooth, but you don't have to worry about this top seam as much because the paint's going to run along there and it's going to be harder to see because of the paint. However, you are going to want to go ahead and smooth this as well as you can. So you can just take your sanding sticks, kind of feel around where you can find any spot where one side or the other is higher, and just see if you can't smooth it out. And the longer you take on this and the better job you do on this, the less likely it is that you're going to see these seams later on. So the more time you spend sanding and smoothing, the less trouble you're going to have further down the line. Try not to put flat spots in here when you're sanding. You want to kind of smooth along in a curve. And one of the difficulties is that the barge cement is a little bit more resilient than the foam is. So it's really easy, even when you get everything flat, you can have a little edge of the barge cement kind of poking up through. Try it in both directions. So pushing along this way and maybe pulling along that way. It's feeling a lot better actually. And then you just want to repeat the process with the different grits of sandpaper. And I'll tell you right now, what works better than the sanding sticks on this is a Dremel tool. And if you don't have one, I would highly suggest going ahead and buying one. I've seen them as cheap as $20. In fact, most of the difference in the sets had to do with whether or not you want a cordless model and mostly how many bits come with it. So for this type of job, what you really need is a corded, just plain Dremel tool, and you need one of these conical sanding bits. As long as you have those two things, you don't need to have all the other pieces, but this will make working on EVA foam, and especially the helmet and cleaning up these seams, much easier and faster. Now obviously you do not need to buy the little pin tool. Just the regular Dremel tool will work just fine. It works really well for cleaning up the edge where the barge cement is coming up through the middle. You can just use, just like you're using a pencil, just sort of the tip here and run it right on the line, just lightly going in the direction that the rotation's wanting to push it. You don't want to press down. You're not really trying to press down and dig into anything. You just want to barely touch it. What you're really wanting is for that barge cement to kind of grab onto this spinning bit and just kind of get ripped out basically. So you're just barely touching it down there. And if you can't get it to come off, or if you don't want to worry about it, it's not a big deal. You're going to have other opportunities later in the process to deal with that. So try not to push down where you make a little canyon here. You can also go when you're doing this, it's less about cleaning off the barge cement and a lot more just smoothing out the two pieces of foam. Okay, and then just do the rest of the top. Okay, now when you're smoothing these joints up, you'll learn that it's really easy to make a little bit of a valley. So you have a high point and then a low spot and a high spot, and you kind of get that kind of a pumpkin kind of a shape. And so it's really good to go back with your sanding sticks and just work on trying to make sure that you smooth everything out to where it's a nice smooth dome. So I'm kind of concentrating on the area a little bit out from the seam itself, where it's kind of high up here and then it stays high and then dives down. And I just want to smooth this part out and a little bit in the middle as well, but I'm just trying to make it it doesn't have to be a perfect dome, a perfect partial sphere. It just needs to be smooth enough that you don't, see it, so that it doesn't look like a pumpkin shape. Okay, and now that you've done it, smooth everything out with your coarse, you know the drill, medium, and then smooth at the end. Now with these two, I'm not worried about removing material. I'm just trying to, smooth everything, all of the grain of it, the texture of the foam. Just wanted to point out, you notice that especially along this section where I have this piece of foam attached on top of this piece, make sure that you're sanding in that direction from the top piece to the bottom piece, because you really don't want to peel that piece of foam up. And that should pretty much do it for the top. Now for these seams here, you want to get your hand up inside here and you kind of bend it to where it's as flat as you can get it. And then you can smooth out those seams. Now, especially on the cheekbone seams, that's where that Dremel tool's really going to come in, because it's so much smaller. You can get in here and really smooth both of these seams out, just as best as you can. Now, just like we did when we were working on this seam up here, you want to be sure and go from the cheekbone onto the trim piece. You want to go from the piece that's below onto the piece that's above, because the direction that this is spinning, that way it's not trying to peel the foam up. It's more pulling it backward and down. So, and I'm just going to go right along here and smooth this up as best I can. I did a little bit when I added these little filler pieces in here when I was smoothing all of that. I did a little bit here, so that's why it looks a little better than you're probably expecting. Now for the trim and here, since they're really flush, there's not one piece on top of the other one. It doesn't matter which direction you go on that one. You just want to try, just like you did with the seams up on the top, you just want to try to make that as smooth as you can. Now, if you'll notice, there are some places that are definitely not smooth on here. And first of all, this seam is not as important. And second of all, we'll get to those a little bit later on. Okay, now that you have everything as smooth as you can reasonably get it, I mean, don't burn through the foam trying to make everything perfectly smooth. We're going to switch gears now, and instead of taking high places off, we're going to try to fill some low places. So what I'm going to do is I have my silver Sharpie. I'm just going to go ahead and look around the helmet. I'm also going to look and see where I can find deep gaps. This is just so that when you actually start filling them, you don't have a whole lot of time to be looking around. So I just want to make sure that I can find what I'm looking for. A little uneven spot from early on. Once you finish marking the helmet, you need to make sure that you clean off all of the dust that you created when you were sanding everything. You can use, I used a canned air duster. You can also use a lightly damp cloth, works really well for that. But if you do that, make sure that you give the helmet time to completely dry afterwards. But once you have everything marked and cleaned off, it's time to decide what we're going to fill these little gaps with. What I see most often, when I see other people working with EVA foam, is this fast dry caulking. And its pluses are that it's easy to work with, it's ready to paint in 20 minutes, so you don't have to wait a long time. You can just use your finger and some water to smooth everything out after you put it in place. Then it dries quickly, and then you can paint over it very quickly after that. If you want to see me use that, if you go back to the Boba Fett helmet part 5, I have a small demonstration on there on how to use that. Other people use Bondo, just the fiberglass filler like you do on your car if you were fixing a dent in your car. What I like is this Bondo bumper repair kit, and I like it better than the Bondo because this is flexible, whereas the Bondo is rigid. You know, the regular Bondo filler is rigid. This will stay flexible. The reason why I like it over the DAP, the caulking, is that once you smooth this out and it dries, that's the way it's going to be. You cannot sand it afterwards. You know, you get it smooth, and then if you paint over it and there's a bump that you don't like, there's not much you can do about it at that point. I like this because it's sandable. It's also flexible, just like the caulk is. It's made to take abuse. It paints really nice. It's designed for that. And for that reason, I really like this. Now, when you buy this, you're probably going to want to go ahead and buy 2 of them. That would be my only critique to this product, is that there's not a lot of it, and depending on how you use it, how sparingly, there's a good chance you're going to want to have 2 of these. Now, if you notice, I have my gloves on. This is just a piece of scrap cardboard that I'm going to use to mix the product on. I've got a rag, and I've got these are tools for working with clay, but you know, just a little scrap of wood works just fine. Okay. So let's go ahead and just do this. Now, you're going to want to be in a fairly well ventilated area and wear protection, including eye protection. So as you see, you just turn this and it's open. You only have about 6 minutes of working with this, even less if it's hotter than 77 degrees outside. So I'd estimate we probably have about 4 minutes, maybe 5. So I'm just going to put a fairly small amount of this. Hardener came out before the resin did on that first try, so we might have more like 3 minutes. And you just want to kind of spread this into the gaps, kind of like if you've ever grouted. You can kind of go diagonally like that, kind of work it in. It's okay if it sticks out a little bit. That's one of the big advantages to being able to sand. I'm going to try one of my little tools here. So you want to smooth it out, but not so much that you leave the depression that you're trying to fill.
And it's possible that you may have to do a couple of these twice. If after you sand everything down, if there's still a gap there, then just mix up some more. I apologize if I move this out of the way where you can't see it. It's just another one of these things where it's hard for me to do a good job on the helmet and do a good job on filming it. And like I said before, it's more important to get it into the gap than to make everything perfectly smooth. Now I can feel this starting to get thicker. So I know it's about to be done. Yep, it is definitely starting to cure now. So once you feel it, once you can actually feel and you're sure that it is definitely starting to cure, is starting to thicken up, you don't want to go ahead and stop. You're now done with that batch. Clean off your tool if you have it, if you're using a tool. Basically at this point, what we need to do is just mix up some more and keep going. The next batch should last a little bit longer because there's no air bubble now in the resin side. So you should get a little bit better, more even mix. And once again, don't mix up very much of it. And get back on it. So up here, I have where when I was sanding, just this the trim layer of foam kind of peeled back in a not very regular way. So I just want to fill that in so it'll be smooth. And where I wasn't paying attention earlier, I cut a little canyon in here and I fill that up. And just continue that all the way around. Oh, here's a seam, so we can kind of go over that real quick. It's really not that different than the other seams, but just kind of try to force it down into it. Basically, I'm holding this at about a 45-degree angle and just kind of pushing it over it so that it kind of forces the filler down into the gaps. I've filled everything up. So now it's just a matter of we have to wait 30 minutes before we can do anything else. You know what I really hate? I hate it when you press record and do everything only to find out that you didn't press it hard enough, or for some reason it didn't turn on. So I've actually finished most of the sanding, so I don't have much to show you at this point, but I will kind of go over what I did. And I will say this, it's been a while since I've done this, and I'd forgotten how much work it is to actually sand off the bumper repair filler. So I would definitely not worry about using it in just tiny little bubbles in the foam. I would just use it in places where you really need to fill a gap, because it's a lot of work, a lot more than I remember. The real secret to this is I'm using just a little strip of 400 grit wet dry sandpaper. And the reason why I'm using such a fine sandpaper is because it will remove the filler, but it won't do very much to the foam. And that's kind of a key to working with this stuff. You can use the Dremel on this, but I really don't suggest it. It's very difficult. What it tends to do is just peel the ends up of the filler and pull big chunks of it off, even when you're trying to, be real careful going in from the outside onto it. You go just a little bit too far and then it pulls a big chunk out of here. Works a little better on larger areas, but even then you have to be really careful and go so lightly with it that you could actually go back and forth, because you're putting almost no pressure on here at all. And you're probably better off just using some sandpaper, fine grit sandpaper. You can use your sanding sticks, but I would only use your finest sanding stick. And just limit it to things that really need to be filled. Don't worry about tiny little imperfections in the foam. Now the good news is if, it doesn't have to be perfectly smooth. I mean, this is supposed to be an implement of war. It's going to have dents and bumps in it. And her paint scheme is so elaborate, you're not going to notice that kind of stuff. So once you have everything as smooth as you can get it, you're going to want to go ahead and sand all of the sharp edges that are all around. You don't want to, flatten them out or blend them in. You just want to take the very sharp edge off for that. And I'm just trying to take the sharp edges off because even though her helmet looks like it's got some fairly sharp edges on it, in real life, when you start looking at it, you're trying to sell the fact that it's an armored helmet, and slightly rounded edges are going to do that a lot better than a sharp edge. You can also use the Dremel tool, works really well for this actually. Don't forget all the stuff back here. You definitely only want to go in the direction that it's kind of pulling you, because if you start fighting against that, it'll start to dig little divots in, and then you'll be trying to smooth those out, and you'll just be in a never-ending fight. But you can see how well the Dremel tool works for that. Something I need to point out is also when you're working on smoothing everything out, any spot where the ear is not perfectly flush with this trim piece, you need to smooth out that so you don't have an overhang needs to be filled. If there's a ledge here, you want to sand that ledge off to at least where it's smooth and you don't have a stair step. So that on both sides. And then after you do all that, we'll be ready to go on to the next thing. Once you have all these parts sanded, you have a decision to make here as well. This under edge part of the helmet, I know some people don't like how thick it is. It doesn't really bother me that it's thick. To me, it just makes it seem more substantial, but if you do want it to be thinner, now is the time to go ahead and mark. I'd say probably 1/8 of an inch out from this outside edge. The other thing about what you want to do now is whether or not you want it thin or not, the helmet should be a little bit, it should actually kind of come up a little bit on the side here so that there's a slight curve from here to the nose. And one of the big problems with this is the fact that with the thickness of the foam, this inside edge sticks down further than the outside edge in some places. So you're going to have to fix that. And then if you want to contour this a little bit, you can do that as well. But it's not as important. The main thing is to take out this edge where it sticks down below the inside edge. And so we want to do, I just usually use I just freehand it. I put my finger and I put that up against the outside edge, and I'll take the marker and I'll place it where I want the mark to be, about, you know, 1/8 of an inch. And then using my finger as a guide, okay, so you have that marked, and I'm going to do the same thing. And once again, I'm just going to eyeball it. On the inside, I'm going to come up maybe 1/2 an inch. This is just kind of giving you something to, you know, just kind of a guide. Like I said, in the past, I haven't used any lines at all. I've just kind of done it. And the reason why I don't go very deep with this bevel is that at the very end, I'm going to want to put a neck ring on here like I did with the Boba Fett helmet. And if I go up really high, I'm not going to be able to put that neck ring in. I have to put it really high up, and that's going to be uncomfortable. So I'm sticking with about 1/2 an inch up on the inside. And then you just want to remove it. What I've done in the past, I think what I'm doing now, is just I'm going to use my knife, and I'm going to, you know, kind of saw away at it. You can use the Dremel tool, but it's going to take a long time. It's going to make a huge mess, and it's probably going to be just as rough as this is. So I think I'm going to use the knife, and then I'll come back and try to clean it up. You know, sand it smooth. Hope you can see this. Try to be more consistent with this edge as opposed to this edge. If it's gonna stray, try to, you know, stray on that inside edge as opposed to the bottom edge. But it's not going to be easy to make perfect. Okay, so I've finished up removing this, and I just need to smooth all of this out. And you'll notice on here, this lip is still sticking down, so I'm also going to want to try to flatten that out. And I think I'm going to go ahead and use my knife for that. Basically the same thing I just did. I'm just going to try to use this outside edge as the line. Just make sure you're doing it at a much shallower angle, because you don't want it to look like it's razor sharp on this side and the rest of the helmet has a flat edge. Probably the sanding sticks are going to work the best. And just try to smooth it out as best you can. I'm going to go ahead and try the Dremel, but I don't have high. I don't think it's going to be that easy or effective. Well, happily I'm wrong, and as long as you go in the direction, it should work out pretty well. Now that you have everything smooth, or at least as smooth as you're willing to take it, it's time to think about how you're going to seal this foam. And you definitely have some choices to make at this point. In the past, I've always started sealing everything by putting somewhere between 3 and 10 coats of PVA glue of some sort, whether it be Elmer's glue or usually for me, it was the Mod Podge. And that process worked fairly well. There was always a few instances of some little bubbles that would pop up, or the occasional small blister would come up. I noticed especially if it was in a hot environment, it tended to get a little bit bubbly sometimes, or just a little bit irregular. But I had always assumed that before you did anything, you really had to seal the foam with some sort of PVA glue, mostly because that seemed to be what everyone that I watched do it used. But then I was watching Svetlana over at Kamui Cosplay, and when she did her testing, she found that the best thing that worked for her was to just go straight onto the foam with Plastidip spray. And that caught my attention because I've been told by several people that the Plastidip wouldn't stick directly to the foam. So I decided to go ahead and do a few tests myself. So I took some pieces of scrap EVA foam, and in this case, I just sprayed it directly with the Plastidip spray, and lo and behold, it sticks very well. These two green spots right here are where I was trying to peel it up, and the only way I was able to peel it up is by peeling up some of the foam itself. So when it peeled up, it took the foam with it. So it's not it peeling up, it's just the foam giving way. Compare that to my experience with the way I had been doing it, where the coat of Mod Podge allows the Plastidip to just peel up real easy. This is not the Plastidip peeling off, which it's made to do in some cases. This is the coating of PVA glue underneath it, just easily peeling up. So I thought, well, if the Plastidip works so well, maybe I'll try using that as my base and doing other things on top of it. Because if you watched my Boba Fett videos, you know that I like to put a coat of urethane over the top of foam that's going to be rigid. So I tried that, and whereas the Plastidip sticks well, the urethane will peel off of the Plastidip, unfortunately. So I thought, well, if it worked for the Plastidip spray, I'll just try to urethane directly on top of the foam. And to my surprise, especially because, once again, I've been told specifically that the urethane would not stick to the foam. Now, in that case, it was the Smoothcast 65D. And what I'm using now is Smoothcast 66D. But when I tested it, it worked perfectly. I mean, it adhered right away, and I was able to do multiple layers, which was also nice. In the past, I've noticed that the urethane that I was using would not stick to itself once it was dry, but with the Smoothcast 66D, I was able to do multiple coats, and I can't get them to peel up at all. As you can see, even where I've tried as hard as I can't get it to peel up. I went ahead and finished the process and painted it to see, how well it was going to work out, and I'm quite happy with it. I could have sanded this one a little better before I painted it, but still. So I've got a new process that I'm going to do and show you today that, at least in my opinion, with what I've found, seems to work better than anything else. Except for perhaps just going with the Plastidip. So if you want to just start painting this right away, then I would go with the Plastidip spray and just spray that. Do several wet coats. It's not like regular spray paint where you want to just lightly put it on. You want to actually go on thick enough that it's a damp coat, that you can actually see that it's wet. I think it kind of self-levels that way a little bit. You want to do several wet coats of the Plasti-Dip spray, and then you can go ahead and paint from there. And I think that'd probably work fine. I want this to be a little bit harder, a little bit more rigid, although it's, it's pretty hard now. But I just want it to be a little bit less foam-like. So I'm going to go ahead and start out by coating this with the urethane, and then we'll go from there. But no matter what you choose, the first thing you're going to have to do is heat seal it, and that you do with your trusty heat gun. Now, if you'll notice, my old heat gun is working again. I would like to say that I took it apart and found the problem and fixed it, but instead I took it apart, couldn't find anything wrong with it, put it back together, and now it works fine. So that seems to be the way that I fix most things. I don't have a clue what I did, but somehow it's fixed. So let's go ahead and heat seal the helmet. I have this turned up to high, and I'm hoping that you can see this when I do it. You just want to, yeah, there you go. I hope you can see that. It kind of looks like a shadow that doesn't go away when you move. It doesn't take much. You don't want to heat this up so much that it deforms or anything. You're just going to lightly go over it with the heat gun. And some of this will have already been heat sealed when we shaped it. But the rest of it will not be, especially if it's had a lot of sanding done to it. And this will just, it kind of seals the top layer of the foam, gets rid of all those little fuzzies that you created when you were sanding everything. You can kind of see it gives the foam a light sheen to it as well. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and do the inside around the outside edge as well, because I want to paint that one as well. Okay, like I said, you're not wanting to deform anything. You just want to hit that top layer of foam. And next we'll go ahead and start applying the urethane. Now you don't have to do this part if you don't want to. I've definitely done several helmets without doing this, and it has not been a big problem at all. But what this is just a stick. Doesn't matter what shape it is, as long as it's, long and skinny. I've got a piece of scrap here. All I've done is screwed this onto here, and then using a washer, I've screwed a piece of scrap foam onto the end. And I'm going to mount the helmet to this, and it's just going to make it easier to move the helmet around without touching it anywhere where you're going to get fingerprints or anything like that. If you're not interested in painting the inside of the helmet, you can just leave it on a table. And I've also just, used the stalk for the rangefinder to manipulate everything, but I'm just trying to make things easy, and I have the scraps laying around, so I've built this little stand. And to mount the helmet, I'm just going to use super glue. I know a lot of people use hot glue for this type thing, but I just haven't had that much luck with it. I'm just going to reach up inside, kind of get this where I want it, and just hold it for about 50 to 20 seconds. It is still a little bit wobbly because of the foam, but it's secure. Now it's time to go ahead and get the urethane ready. Now, first of all, don't panic and turn off the video. I know for a lot of you, you will have never used anything like this, and so it's intimidating, but I can assure you this is easy as can be. There's nothing really difficult or intimidating about using urethane. It's just you're going to pour equal amounts of part A and part B into here and stir it up, and then it's just like anything else you've ever used. The only difference is that it is going to cure in about 7 minutes, so you don't want to use anything
permanent because it will be ruined. What I have here is something to mix part A and B into. I have some little measuring cups that are from Liquid Medicine. My kids have outgrown that, so I have about 1 million of these things. You can use anything that'll hold liquid and that you can mark a level on. So basically, even like Dixie cups will work fine as long as you have some way to mark them at the same height. I have some chopsticks, but you can use anything. You need something to stir up the individual parts. And then I've got some other little sticks, any kind of scrap wood that I'll use to mix up this part. Oh, and of course, a disposable brush. If you like using foam brushes, they're even cheaper than these. I don't like the foam brushes. It seems to me like they actually make bubbles in whatever I'm trying to put on. And oddly enough, I swear they make brush marks where I don't get the same kind of brush marks with a brush. That's just me. If you use and like the foam brushes, then by all means use those. Oh, and you're also going to need some gloves. I remembered this time. It's amazing. And I'm just going to stir these really well. Now this is the 66D by Smoothcast, and you can buy this on their website. I'll post a link down below so that you can see where you can get this stuff. The caps say to shake this really well, but I think that also puts bubbles in it, so I don't want to do that. Well, the cap says to shake it, but it says to stir it down here, so it's, I guess, whatever you want to do. So I suppose that shaking probably does a better job of mixing, but then you have a better chance of getting air bubbles in the mix. In the past, I've used Smoothcast 65D, which works. I like the 66D a little better because it has a little bit longer work time, or as I say, pot life. It also is a little bit more rigid. It dries gray instead of translucent white, which actually just kind of looks better psychologically. And I've noticed that it will stick to itself even after it's dry, whereas the 65D didn't do that for me. Now, I don't know what officially what the word is on that, but in my experience, the 66D would stick to itself and the 65D would not. So I'm going to go ahead and just mix up 3 tablespoons in each one of these. Looks pretty good though. And so you just pour these together into your container. You don't want to mix up more than you can use in 7 minutes. Stir this up pretty good. This does not smell particularly bad, but I think even so, I would try to be in a reasonably well ventilated area. That probably goes with, anything, including paint. So now I have 7 minutes before this starts to cure. And it's pretty thin. So I'm going to start off just by brushing it on. Try and catch any runs. If you miss them for too long, you'll end up with something you're going to have to sand out. I'm just trying to get everything covered while avoiding any big runs that run down the side anywhere. Well, this at this point is so thin that it's not going to accomplish very much, but what's great about it being able to put multiple coats on is that I can build up some thickness to this.
Now I was all prepared for a completely different process for this helmet, but that was when I thought that it was a little bit more similar in construction to the Boba Fett helmet, which has a much more defined dome, which comes all the way down to just above eye level, all the way around. It basically comes all the way down to where the sides flatten out. And so I was going to just kind of build a little container and pour the resin over the top of the dome by itself before I even put it on, so that I could get a nice thick coat. But this one, the dome itself is so small in comparison with the rest of the helmet that it's really not worth it. And I'm also just kind of waiting until the mix thickens up enough. Once it starts to get thicker and not flow like water, I'm going to do things a little bit differently. You can see into there. I'm just kind of seeing how it starts to flow. I can feel that it's starting to heat up now. And when it starts to flow a little bit more like thick syrup, I'm going to try pouring it directly on top and then move the whole helmet around. It's kind of a fine line between when it gets too thick and it's just not going to flow and very quickly set, compared to when it's too thin. Okay, so you can kind of see that it's not water anymore. It's reasonably thick. So I'm going to take this and I'm just going to kind of pour some of it on. You don't want to do very much. Yeah, I think it may already be getting a little bit thick. It's sort of stopped flowing. Now, once it really starts to thicken up, you don't want to try to brush it on. So any later than than right now, you do not want to start brushing it. That's the mistake I made the very first time I tried to do this. I kept trying to brush it on, and then I started getting these clumps. Okay, so I think this batch is done, and I'll mix up another batch and we'll keep going. Okay, we're ready for the second batch. I've filled this one a little higher. You can see when it starts to cure, you start to get this light gray. And when you're buying these brushes, buy a bunch of them. They're just over $1 a piece. I think I bought like 6 of these. That may not actually be enough now that I think about it. You might want to go for more like 10. After one usage, I don't know if you can see this, but it's now a solid block of urethane. It's not going to move at all. Have my new batch, new brush. And try to avoid getting it any place you don't need it, like on the wood. It's okay if you get a little bit on there, but it's, you know, there's no need giving yourself more work. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit this area just because I've got so much on it already. I'm going to try to keep it a little bit consistent. Try to keep it smooth, because any large inconsistencies you're just going to have to come back and sand off. These earpieces are so simple that I'm not terribly worried about getting the urethane on them. The Boba Fett ones were much more intricate, so I was having troubles with it because you end up with globs in places that you can't really sand very easily. Oops. A bunch of those I didn't see. The difficulty there is that trying to take the tape off later, if it's sort of, you know, part of the rest of the helmet.
It'll make that a little bit more difficult. This one's almost getting thick enough. Once again, I'm just going to take this, pour some on here. That's what I'm trying to avoid right there. And unfortunately, you kind of have to give up some control here. But don't panic, it's not that bad with that helmet. And I'm going to dangle it like this a little bit so they can flow back toward the top. Looks like I've got some cleanup to do. So I'm going to mix up another batch and we'll keep this up. So as it turns out, you want to let the urethane completely cure. It takes about an hour. So let it completely cure before you put another coat on it. I don't know if you begin to see in the last coat, it was almost like it was starting to bead up. And I think that was because I'd only let it cure for 15 minutes. And I hadn't had a problem like that when I was doing my tests, but on my tests, I had let the urethane cure for a full hour before I put a second coat on. So I did that. I had to sand all of that roughness off, put another coat on just to make sure it would work. It works fine. So now we're ready to keep going. So you're going to want just to go back over it. You can put a coat on, but then you need to wait an hour for it to cure before putting a second coat on. If it's rough, you can give it a little light sanding. Just make sure you clean off any of the dust. So now it's been an hour. I'm going to put my part A and B in. This is my old cup. So I'm going to go ahead and put another coat on the top again. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and move to the back, or maybe do the front. I guess I'll just go all the way around. Playing it by ear. I'm not going to put any into the air filter area. I'm just afraid that it'll get in there and fill up those little areas, and I like the texture that's in there. Okay, now I'm just going to do like I have in the past. Seems like I always get to that point where it's just a little bit too thick that it doesn't want to flow. Since I covered everything, I guess I'll go ahead and wait an hour. I'll wait an hour and then I'll put another coat on. So it's been another hour. I very lightly sanded this with the medium grit sandpaper. I guess I have to mix my parts. Now for this one, I'm just going to concentrate on this front section here and maybe this section here and then the inside rim here. Now, you might be curious as to
when you're done with this process. And I'll give you three, possibilities, when one of these things happens. Number one, do you just get to the point where it's like, wow, I can't believe how incredibly thick the coating has become, to where it's, like a hard hat kind of thickness. Or number two, which is more likely, which is you get a nice consistent gray color throughout the entire helmet. Or lastly, you run out of brushes. Now, I have to tell you, this little stand / handle that I put on is really handy when you're painting. Not so handy when you're sanding. It's kind of a pain. So I might have actually jumped the gun a little bit on putting this on. I'd love to be able to just do one side, and I guess I still could just pick a side and get a fairly thick coat. But then I can, I can only do one side. I can't do both sides. So maybe I'll do that, but I'll just do this side. I think I'm just gonna kind of pour some in the way I did with the top. I don't want to do it too much because I don't want to fill in the sort of relief that I have here. Okay, this is almost too thick to use the brush, so I'm going to kind of spread this out and then leave the brush alone. I want to try to stop any drips from forming on the underside this time. I think I got a nice coating on that. I'm pretty excited about that. Can't you tell? I'm just going to continue to move this around until I can kind of tell from the brush when it is solidified. The smart thing to do would be to set a timer, because I know it has a 7-minute pot life. Unfortunately, I'm using my phone with my timer as the camera, so this brush is really getting stiff now. The urethane is really gooey at this point on the brush, so I feel pretty good about just setting this down now. And you know the drill. I'll wait an hour and then take a look at it. I'm going to do the same thing as last time, only instead of putting a large amount on this side, I'm going to put a large amount on this side. I went ahead and did a light sanding all over everything again as well. It's interesting, this stuff seems to dry with a very rough surface. But at the same time, there are some parts of the helmet where it dries, where it's, glass smooth. So I don't know what the difference is in those two areas. Careful on this. I'd like to get this side in, but I don't want to get a bunch of it down into the filter area itself. If I do, I'll do it the last time. I'll just put a very thin coat in there just so that it'll be the same. And to do all of these coats is probably going to take you the best part, the better part of an entire day. So a day when you've got other things to do, you can just come in, put on a coat, go do something else for an hour, maybe work on a different part of your costume. Starting to thicken up a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and very quickly get this bottom edge. Just like before, I'm just going to try to feather this bottom edge out a little bit. And just before it drips, I'm going to get it to flow back the other way. But now it's nice and smooth everywhere. I'm just going to continue to move this around so that nothing drips off, but kind of maintain. Actually, what I'm trying to do at this point is to get the most thickness to be right along this edge right here, between the lower part of the cheekbone and this upper part of, I guess, the cheek area. It's very smooth at this point. I don't know what it is that makes part of it, the vast majority of it, cure with a very rough texture. That's what fingers are for with gloves. You also want to be careful and make sure it does not get into this area where your rangefinder is, or it will lock it into place where it won't move. So once again, wait an hour and then come back and take a look at it. So back again, and this time I did not do any light sanding, just so you could see it the way it looks after everything's cured. And you can kind of see what I was talking about. Some areas where it is just, reflective and shiny, and other areas, a texture here. I see it a little better here. And I don't know what the difference is in what's happening, but that's the way it is. I'm not going to sand this time just because I want to see what happens. To see if I need to sand in between, or if it's okay to just put one coat on top of another cured coat. And I was saying before, you're done when it's either just super thick and you're really happy with it, you get an even coating of gray, or you run out of brushes. Well, I'm really close to running out of brushes and getting a good gray everywhere. So hopefully I can achieve the good gray in the back, where it's a nice even texture or tone in the back, because I am definitely low on brushes. I think I'll go ahead and put some on the top again. So remember, the point is not to get this as thin as possible. You're actually trying to build up a fairly thick layer. So definitely don't be stingy with the urethane. kind of expecting this to be my last layer, so I'm just going to put a thin, just a thin coat on this section. I definitely don't want it to soak into the little burned out areas. We're starting to cure a little faster than I was expecting. Again, I'm going to quickly put one coat on this little bottom lip down here. Just smoothing things out a little bit with my finger. So I think it's probably safe that I can set this down now and wait another hour. Okay, it's been an hour and this all looks good. The last coat's of the shiny variety. So I'm just going to sand everything, any drips or any weird shapes or rough areas. I'm just going to smooth everything out. And to do that, I've got just one of my foam sanding blocks, and I've taken the 60 grit and just taped it around here. I just like the flexibility of the foam. And I'm not really trying to change the shape that much. I'm just trying to smooth things out. Any wavy areas, let's see if I can just kind of smooth that out a little bit. If it's a really deep area, I'm not going to worry about it too much at this point. I'll come back a little bit later and work with that. Try to go in circles. That way you don't end up with, streaks or anything. Also, your 60 grit sanding stick works really well. I'm going to try to get this into the screen more. There's most likely going to be a ridge kind of built up on every edge. And you want to try to take that down a little bit. That's where your sanding stick really is going to come in handy. A little bit too aggressive sandpaper for such a thin area of urethane. A little finer sandpaper. Just feathering that out, so in case that happens to you. I think maybe I'll do the rest of the mandibles and the upper cheeks with the 120 grit. Be more aggressive now where I know I've got a thick coat. So if you start seeing areas where you can kind of see that the urethane is getting a little bit thin, you can kind of see some color coming through, then go ahead and stop on that area. It doesn't have to be perfectly smooth at this point. Remember, there's not much back here at all, so I'm basically just kind of scuffing up the surface, taking the gloss off of it. I use the 120 sanding stick. Back here, I've got, you know, more than I do here, but it still was just brushed on a few times, so I don't want to get as aggressive as it was on the areas where I poured it on. Just rough it up a little bit. Any places where there's more texture, kind of smooth that out. You can kind of tell when there's uneven areas because it'll get dull in the top areas and still shiny. If it's too deep, don't worry about it. We'll come back with some other stuff and take care of that a little bit later. If you have any drips or big globs in the top or the bottom of these, now's the time to try to clean that up. Now granted, you kind of want it to have a transition. It should look like it's welded. You don't want it to look like it's molded out of a mold. Okay, that's pretty much it. I'll probably go back and do a little bit more smoothing, but it'll just look the same as what I just did. So once I smooth this out a little bit more, we'll be on to the next step. Now that I have everything scuffed up and smoothed up pretty well, there's a few little low spots here and there, but I don't want to remove the urethane to get down to the level of a low spot. I'm going to fill that. So I have this ready. I'm going to go ahead and put a couple of coats of this 2-in-1 filler and primer from Duplicolor. You can get this or similar product to this at most auto parts stores. I got this at O'Reilly's. I'm sure they'll have something very similar to this wherever you live. And I have done everything that I can to remove all the dust. And typical, it's been bright and sunny here for a month. I don't think we had any rain for a month. And now it's time for me to start spray painting things. And yesterday and today it's been raining, so I am right at the limit in humidity. So I'm gonna have to just put a coat on and then take it inside and hope that'll be good enough. And I'm just gonna do a thin coat. You might note that I did mask off the aluminum. In the areas where I had sanded off the urethane, I wanted to protect them a little bit, so I just dripped some super glue onto it and then wiped it across with a rag. I just put a little bit of something on there other than just the paint. Not sure that was necessary. I just felt like I wanted it to have something to kind of fill it up. And notice I'm not spraying it back and forth. I'm coming across and hitting starting to spray as I go across, then letting up. If you are spraying and you stop and change directions, you're going to get a lot more paint in that one spot. And you want to try to get an even coat. And yeah. So turn the cam side down and clear the can. And I'll let this dry and then we'll put another coat on. It's been 10 minutes and now I'm going to go ahead and put a second light coat on it. So if you didn't mask off the inside of your visor, be very careful not to spray up inside. Speaking of spraying on the inside, I'm going to go ahead and spray these edges, being careful not to spray the visor any more than I need to. Okay, wait another 10 minutes and we'll put the third coat on. It's been 10 more minutes and it's time to do the third coat. Now we did 2 light coats and now we're going to do 1 heavier, let's say as a wet coat. So we're going to go ahead and put it on heavy enough that it kind of shines. But not so heavy that you get any drips. So I'll let this dry for 30 minutes and we'll be on to the next step. Okay, it's been 30 minutes. Everything's dry. And I think I mentioned before that the subtitle for this episode is Endless Sanding. And we don't want to really remove material. We're just going to scuff it up, take off any of this little bit of texture that's on here. This is 400 grit sandpaper. You know, it's whatever the finest sandpaper that you have. And just lightly go over the whole thing. You don't have to have a sanding block, it's just nice to have something to hold on to the paper. Take off, see all these little sharp, jagged parts there. I'm going to take that off, but for the most part, you're just scuffing things up and smoothing out any spray texture. At this point, I'm just feeling for rough spots. And this is just another sanding pad that's I think it's either 400 or 500 grit. If I find a rough spot, then I can come over and smooth it out. I'm just taking these little jagged edges off of the eyes. Now, if they're caused by drips of the urethane, you're not going to be able to do much with this fine sandpaper. If I have to, I'll just come in there and cut that off with an X-Acto. Almost there. One last little bit here. Okay, everything feels nice and smooth. I'm just going to dust everything off of here. and then we'll go on to the next step. I know this looks the same as it did in the last scene, but in actuality, it's a day later and we're back to where we were before I ran off down a process that was a problem to begin with and only got worse. You see, when I did the original test piece, the urethane layer ended up with hundreds of little bubble holes in it, and the filler primer didn't do anything to help. But I was able to fill them with a couple of coats of acrylic gesso. That's a product used by artists to coat a canvas before doing a painting. Kind of gives you that nice even surface instead of painting on canvas. Now, I didn't have that mysterious bubble problem with my helmet, but there were a few low spots, and in particular, this low area right through here that's caused by the visor trim. And I thought I might be able to fix it with the gesso. Well, it didn't work, and it took forever, and it cracked way more than I was expecting. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't a complete disaster. It did smooth out some of the rougher parts of the helmet, but it's just not worth the time and effort to completely coat the helmet thick enough for it to do what I wanted. But I will show you how to use it to fill in some minor imperfections you might come across on your helmet. Okay, so this is the gesso, just white acrylic gesso, and it's just kind of a thick paint, sort of, but it's a lot easier to sand. Normally you would thin this with some water and then use a roller to roll across your canvas, put several thin layers on it, and then sand it completely smooth. I'm just going to use it to fill in some little spots here and there. So I'm not going to thin it. In fact, if I could find it thicker, I would probably do that. You could use the bumper repair for this, or I've even used wood putty for some things like this. The problem with those products is they're going to be harder than the rest of the surface around it. So it's going to be hard to sand it flush without sanding away the stuff, you know, around it. It works pretty well with the foam because the foam doesn't want to be sanded. Whereas, you know, what's on here now will happily be sanded. So I've just got a small brush, and I'm just going to come over to some spots. You want to put it on thick enough that it will fill in the space, but you don't want to, you know, make a big area, because anything that you put on here you're going to have to sand away. I don't know if you can see, there's kind of a rough area. There we go. So I'm just going to try to fill that. It would be great if it was thick enough that you could just kind of, you know, push it in there and then smooth it out with your finger, kind of like an epoxy putty. But then it would still be this material so that I could sand it. If you know of any material like that, feel free to let me know. I always kind of dreamed of something kind of like mud that you would use when you're taping and bedding a wall in your house before you paint it. You know, spackle kind of a product. But unlike that, would dry or cure in less than 24 hours and would be flexible so it wouldn't, you know, break and crack. This is a similar area to the other spot that I showed you. It's just a little bit jagged. I just want to smooth it out a little bit. And unfortunately, I'll have to sand all these little brush strokes away. What I want to do, my urge is to try to smooth all this out. That's just going to give me more sanding to do. A few rough areas in here. This is, I almost hesitate to do this because it is so hard to get in here and sand. There's kind of a little gap in here that I need to actually fill in, so. Okay, I think that's pretty good. So I'll let this dry. It'll probably take about 20, maybe 30 minutes. It's fairly humid, so it kind of drags it out a little bit. And we'll be back for the next step. It's been about 45 minutes. I told you it was humid. And I'm pretty sure that's dry. I can't push it in and get, there's no movement when I try to push in on it. So everything's dry. I'm just taking a little piece of the medium sandpaper. I have another piece of the fine sandpaper that I used on the sanding sticks. And probably just take the fine. I like to go in a circular pattern at this point, just to avoid little streaks. And remember, the filler primer is very thin, so don't put any pressure on this. You're just very lightly moving it around. I can feel that it's pretty close to flat. There's a little bit of a rise right in the middle, so I'm very carefully trying to remove that without affecting the rest of it. Can't really do circles here because I'm trying to get this edge. It feels pretty smooth. You can kind of see, if I can see or not, there's still some little depressions in there. So, sometimes you just have to do more than one layer. Now the question is that any more of they're kind of all the way around. This kind of looks like a little bit of a weld. So it's kind of texture that goes around. So I don't think I'm going to do another layer, but if this was a spot that, that would stand out, then I would go ahead and just do another layer. Keep doing thin layers until you fill in the spot you're looking for. If you get it too thick, it'll just crack when it dries. I'm not trying to sand out the place that I filled in, so I'm more worried about beveling feathering this edge so that it blends in smoothly with the other parts of the paint and get out any brush strokes. Similar situation to the other one. There are definitely some little gaps in there, some little dips, but it's not that different from the rest of it. Now, if I put a coat of primer on here and it looks like it stands out, then I'll just sand it and then fill it if I need to. Sometimes it's difficult to see what the real texture is when you've got lighter and darker gray or white, because it looks like there's a lot of texture there, but there's not. And then when you paint a solid color over the top of it, then you could actually tell how smooth it really is. And when that happens, just don't act like, oh, it's painted now, I can't do anything about it. Just go in and sand it, or fill it, depending on what it needs. Because what happens is the light area, or the higher area, is going to sand off, and the low area is going to stay there, and it could be perfectly smooth, but it's going to look like there's an uneven area there. Oh, can't forget in here. This is just my 320 sanding stick. I can kind of is pretty handy for making more of a corner. The problem with the gesso and the filler and the filler primer is they tend to clog up your sandpaper, because after all, that's what they're made for, is to fill in small gaps. Once again, it looks bad, but it feels pretty smooth. So I think I'll leave that alone and go ahead and put another coat of the primer on it. With an old brush. It's not very good for painting, but it works pretty well for dusting. Someday I'm going to buy a compressor just so I can use that air to get rid of dust. Okay, I think we're ready to go ahead and put another coat on. Don't feel bad if you have a lot more little imperfections that you need to fill. You have to remember that I put a very thick coat of the gesso over the entire helmet, and then had to sand most of it off. But it did fill in a bunch of little imperfections throughout the helmet. But when you are happy with it, go ahead and give it 3 coats of the primer like I did here, 2 light and then 1 heavy coat. And so now we're ready for the next step, which, you guessed it, is sanding again. Nothing really heavy at this point. You're just wanting to smooth up any texture that is on there from the spray paint and to give it a slight, tooth to it. So use your finest sandpaper and just kind of go over it. Like I said, it's just endless sanding at this stage. And trust me, I have not shown but a fraction of it. So I've pretty much given up on trying to put any kind of a filler through this area here. The thickness of this visor material and the thickness of the visor trim add up to a pretty significant thickness, more than I was really counting on. But like I said, once you get this painted, I think you're not really going to notice that. At least not enough to go to the extremes that it would take, I think, to fix it. I've done a couple of tests with some different putties and things, and trying to get it to blend in well and not crack and to actually stick to this is has been problematic, and it's just, I don't think it's worth the effort. So I'm not going to worry about it. I may come back and revisit it sometime in the future after I've finished the rest of the cosplays on the Mandalorians. I may come back with a slightly different construction on how to do this, but that's something for the future. I think this is going to turn out just fine. This will be one of those things where, a week after I've got it finished, I won't even remember that there's an issue, and I'll just be happy with it. So essentially, it's ready to paint. I'm going to do one last step, which you don't have to do, and to be honest, I'm basically just doing it so I'll have that thumbnail shot for the video itself. So I'll be back in just a second. And like I said, there's really no need to do this. I've just got this metallic hammered paint. It looks like it has a texture, but it's not much of a texture, so I'm not too worried about it. And I've shaken this for 1 full minute, and now I'm going to put 3 coats on.
And here's the helmet after 3 coats of paint. The hammered effect comes from the way the 3 separate coats interact. I also removed the tape and then remasked the visor on the outside.
I like to do this after the urethane and primer. Just make sure you run a knife down the edges so you cut any urethane that might be connecting the tape to the visor trim before you pull off the tape. In the next video, we'll put on Sabine's custom paint job and hopefully get to weather it as well. If you have any questions or comments, please leave me a comment below and I'll do my best to help. As usual, if you've enjoyed this video or found it helpful, please give it a like, as that helps keep me motivated. And subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the upcoming videos where we finish and paint Sabine's helmet, as well as the rest of hers, Boba's, and Django's equipment. I look forward to the next video, and until then, thanks for watching.